Okay, numbers of participants are slowly stabilizing, so I guess it's a good time to start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session, What Year Is It? Navigating Time in LCA. My name is Timo Diepers, and I am co-chairing the session together with Amelie Müller. And yeah, we have put together the session because recently there's been a lot of progress in the representation of time in LCA, very broadly speaking. And the underlying assumption of conventional LCA that assumes that we live in a steady-state, idealized world has been challenged from all sorts of different angles, because it turns out reality is actually pretty dynamic and not really static. And yeah, today we'll hear from 3 different speakers who will share different ways of including a time dimension in LCA. The first presentation will be by Romain Sacchi, who will share how future scenarios can be used in LCA. Next up, Simon Bruhn will take a step in the opposite direction, presenting on historical LCA. And lastly, Amelie Müller will present an approach to more coherently make use of scenario data overall. Each presentation is going to be around 10 minutes long with a short round of questions afterwards. And of course, all of you are very welcome to participate in the question rounds. And then in the end, after the presentations, we will have a more general discussion of all overarching topics. Okay, and at this point, I would like to highlight what you can already read at the bottom of the slide here. This session is being recorded. So in case you're not comfortable with your video or audio being recorded, you can just turn it off. But of course, you can still ask questions if you have any, just using the chat function. Okay, that being said, I would like to pass the word to our first speaker, Romain. So feel free to share your screen.
Yes, hello, thank you, Timo, and thank you for having me in this session. So I will start sharing my screen immediately, and you should be seeing my slides now. Right, so what year is it? Navigating Time in LCA, the title of this session. So I decided to show a few slides that focus on Prospective LCA database. So Prospective LCA is a very growing topic, and we usually make the distinction. Well, there is dynamic LCA, prospective LCA. There is a combination of two, as we will see a bit later on. But within prospective LCA, we also talk about foreground modeling, background modeling, and in these slides, I will focus more on the background modeling and prospective LCA databases. There's history to it. We're certainly not the first one to look into that. There's been a few pioneering works, notably from Thomas Gibbon and colleagues from back then at NTNO, which built the 𝐒𝐫𝐬𝐴 framework, building on scenarios from the International Energy Agency, which they integrated into a life cycle assessment database called 𝐒𝐫𝐬𝐬𝐢𝐶, coupled with 𝐒𝐫𝐬𝐿. And then we had the pioneering work as well of Angelica Mendoza and Brian Cox in 2018 with their paper called When Background Matters, where they started to extract insights from integrated assessment model scenarios into the 𝐒𝐫𝐬𝐬𝐢𝐶 lifecycle assessment database. And then there's been a few notable tools. Sorry, maybe this is in the way, which is represented in those green rectangles, which have helped us progressively streamlining the production of and the use of prospective LCA database. And that the tool in question I'm going to be talking about from now on is Premise, which we released in 2022. But Premise itself relies on tools that have been released earlier, one of them being 𝐒𝐲𝐻𝑇 in 2007 by Christopher Mittel. And then there's still, of course, ongoing work using Premise. That's the beauty of open source development. And you'll have a few slides by Timo and Amelie later on Time-explicit, but also other libraries like Pathways, which we are developing here at PSE. So if we are to talk about Premise, Premise is a tool that produces life cycle assessment databases, and it does so by basically consuming a copy of the 𝐒𝐿CAVE database, and together with a specific future energy scenario, which are produced by integrated assessment models. And then Premise would add as well to that some additional inventories, which represent emerging technologies, which are not necessarily present in 𝐒𝐿CAVE. And then it will spit out some sort of modified 𝐒𝐿CAVE database with a narrative or storyline integrated into it. And then you can use these databases in a number of LCA software. We have a specifically good integration with the activity browser, which is this interface, a graphic user interface for Brightway. And this whole workflow is operating in Python, which provides this seamless integration between tools. The second option would be to go a step further, look to do a system-wide LCA. And for that, we have developed another library called Pathways. So Pathways will ingest premise databases, and then it will basically do an LCA of the whole IAM scenario you provide, to look specifically at net zero energy scenarios, to see if we really reach net zero when looking at it through LCA, and if also we have trade-off with respect to other types of environmental impacts as we try to reduce our greenhouse gas emission. We also have ongoing development to calculate LCA coefficients from premise database and try to feed those coefficients back into integrated assessment models so that they would start developing energy scenarios with other environmental concerns than climate in mind. So maybe we could one day optimize scenarios, like provide scenarios that optimize or that minimize impact on biodiversity and these kind of things. But a few numbers about Premise. Premise has been quite successful. We are very happy for that. It was released 2 years ago, and now it's already used on a significant scale, I would say. We are currently linking with 3 integrated assessment models, and we have 3 more to come. And we have currently 23 energy scenarios, prospective energy scenarios you can integrate in 𝐒𝐿CAVE. Right now, Premise integrates projections from a few significant sectors like the power production, fuel, biomass, steel, cement, and transport. And it's particularly appreciated in connection to, or when it's being used together with the Brightway LCA software or the activity browser, which is an interface for Brightway, which provides additional functionalities. Premise is also means additional inventories. So currently Premise contains a catalog of 2,300 datasets, which are peer-reviewed and documented as best as we can. And they're also compatible for 𝐒𝐿CAVE version from spanning from 3.6 to 3.10 and 3.11 since it was released day before yesterday, I think. And so we have a good representation of emerging technologies going from new PV technologies all the way to different carbon dioxide removal plants. When we use it together with the activity browser, we're able to consider different scenarios, notably through the use of superstructure database. So, for example, here we would use Premise to produce, to integrate the projections of the same IAM model in the same type of scenario, but for 4 different points in time. And then the activity browser allows us to do the LCA of a given product and give us the results while switching the background database to these 4 different point in times. So that's very useful when you want to look at the performance of your system across many different scenarios and across different point in time. We also have this functionality of incremental database where you can do the same LCA, but for a given year and a given scenario, and then it would highlight the contribution of specific sectors into reducing the environmental score of your product. So for example, in this case, the blue bar is the carbon footprint of this chemical using the regular eco-invent database. And then as soon as we start to integrate the projections from the electricity sector in 2040, we reduce by a third the environmental impact. And then as we integrate also progress in terms of steel production, cement, car fuels, and so on, we can actually see the increment in score reduction, and we can attribute them to different sectors. Also, the benefit of being able to look at this scenario through the lens of LCA is that we have access to other types of indicators. So here, for example, I do the LCA of 1 kilowatt hour of global electricity relative to 2020. So 2020 is index 100. And I use 4 different models, IEM models, but they all have the same energy scenario. They all point to less than 2 degrees of global warming by 2100. And what we can see is that they all agree that the carbon footprint of 1 kilowatt hour of global electricity converges towards 0. That's the red circle. But what's interesting to see is that these scenarios do not necessarily solve other issues, other environmental issues, which I listed here. So some of them decrease, but not to the same extent. And in fact, some of them increase. So for example, typically in this climate ambitious scenario, we see an increased use in metals, in water, in land. And that's not the case in all models, because not all models will develop the same portfolio of technology to reach a net zero objective, for example. So this is the kind of insight we get with LCA. Premise also allows the integration of custom scenarios on top of IEM scenarios. So we have a repository with community scenarios built by premise users, which can be given on top of a given IEM scenario or not by itself also. That's also possible. And so here we have the example of a scenario for ammonia where produced by a user, which basically deactivate the ammonia market in eco-invent and replace it by a prospective ammonia market with varying shares of different ammonia production pathways and varying efficiencies over time and so on. And what's coming very quickly for premise, so we will progressively integrate mass flow analysis to calculate, among other things, future recycling rates. We hope to get better at regionalized impact assessment, probably using GIS. We are also striving to a tighter integration between premise and integrated assessment model / energy system model. And we're also actively working on pathways, this library that allows you to do prospective LCA of the entire energy system scenario. And we show an example here where we can, for example, project demand for various metals at the national level and these kind of things. That was it. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, can take those up.
Yes, thank you, Romain, for your nice talk. Yeah, maybe, the question to the participants, if there are any questions. Okay, currently not, but I have a question, of course. So you showed also in one of the graphs the differences between the impact categories that arise from using these scenarios. And the underlying scenarios that you use from the IAMs, they are pretty much based on climate change targets, right? So can you give us an idea or a suggestion how we should treat other impact categories or the results of other impact categories that we can calculate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You should treat them with caution, because at the end of the day, premise changes the database according to these energy scenarios, which focus on energy, and it will leave untouched most of the eco-invent database, which have nothing to, like at least those processes which are not really related to energy, because it doesn't have any information about those. And so if you have some indicators or impacts going up, which are being influenced by activities that have not really been updated, then this is raising a flag. This is telling you, okay, maybe I have an increase in impact in, I don't know, freshwater toxicity, because we are just scaling up some current practice in the future. But it is very likely that if we use some toxic substance in the future, we will regulate these kind of substances, which is in itself a useful result. I mean, it's telling you the indicator is not maybe reliable, but it's also telling you if we are to scale up these kind of technologies, we need to do something about these substances. So overall, CO2 and energy indicators from premise database are reliable as far as the scenario is reliable. Other indicators, you need to investigate whether increases in impacts are justified or not.
Okay, thanks a lot. There have been a couple of questions in the chat now. And the first one is that a person would like to use this in activity browser, but is not sure where to find and import it.
Right, so you have two options. Either you are familiar with Python and you can use the premise library to create your own database and export them to activity browser. Or if you're not too familiar with Python, you can, from the activity browser, you can install a plugin called ScenarioLink, which allows you to import premise database directly in activity browser without coding. So maybe I can put the link to this plugin.
Yes, I just posted the link in the chat to the ScenarioLink plugin.
Great. Thanks.
So, okay, thanks. Another question was about the cement sector. So the question is how CCS and other changes in cement composition are covered by the scenarios.
Yeah, so this is very much up to the IEM model, how much detail they go with respect to cement production. Most IEM will stick with regular cement. Some might project a reduction in the clinker ratio, and then they would add different kind of CCS technologies to it. So that's the current state of things right now. They don't really model alternate types of cement.
Okay, maybe as a last question, that is how it's possible to contribute to the database or to the LCIs, I guess, that premise uses. If it's possible to, for example, include LCAs that a person did on emerging products and so on. If it's possible to contribute in some way that premise can use those in the protections.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually I encourage people, if you have good inventories of emerging technologies, I would be super glad if we can have them into premise. So just write me an email and send me your inventories, and then we have a look at it, and then we integrate them.
Great. Okay, one more thing was a question on where the additional data is stored, so the additional LCIs, if that's just available.
So I'm not sure I completely get the question, but there is extensive documentation that points to the scenario data and all the additional inventories premises adding. So things are usually quite transparent. And if the documentation doesn't cover a specific aspect, you're always free to write us an email, and I'm sure we have an answer.
Okay, thanks a lot, Romain. I think
Welcome.
it's time to move on to the next talk, which, as I mentioned, goes in the different direction, not looking at the future, but rather looking at the past. So, Simon, the stage is yours.
Simon, you're still muted.
Yeah, just gonna make it all work with the technology and the multiple screens here. There we go. You should see the presentation now, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Simon, and I've had the pleasure of visiting PSI and working with Romain. And currently I'm finishing my PhD studies at the University of Southern Denmark. And what I would contribute to this presentation is I will take you back to the future. And specifically, I've been working with historical life cycle assessment, which, as you say, is the opposite direction. But I've been using some of the same methods as I've also been using premise in that work. Yeah, so I published a study early this year where we did historical life cycle assessment back to the 1860s in Denmark and tracked until today. And by historical, I don't mean that we use outdated data, which is the case in some life cycle assessments. What I mean is we make this time machine and we try to put ourselves into the past and see what would the result be given this context, given the technology they had and the different consumption patterns. Yeah, so this study was commissioned by a bigger research project in Denmark, led by a number of different museums. And basically what they asked us to do was to say, what was the carbon footprint of an average Danish person in this long historical time frame? And they asked us to look at 5 consumption segments. That was housing, the energy use in the house, transportation, food, and furniture. And you might ask, well, are those 5 enough to cover the entire carbon footprint of a Danish person? And I won't go too much in detail. It's a super long read, but I invite you, if something sparks your curiosity, go and focus on those chapters. And I hope you'll find something interesting. Yeah, but is these 5 segments enough? Well, when we took the most, like the results of the year of the 2010s and compared to a national account, we could see that our process-based LCA results, they would capture about half of the carbon footprint that they got from doing a full input-output study from Denmark. That means that they also capture stuff like educational sectors, healthcare, all this stuff that actually needs to be there for society to run. And we get half of that by focusing on the 5 sectors. So not entirely complete, but we also conclude that it's still quite robust. And in short, the results, as you can see here, we have 5 time steps along the timeline. And back at the Industrial Revolution in the 1860s and the coming years, things changed a bit slowly. But then something happens in the 1970s where oil gets abundant, people get their own private cars, and the cultures change. And we see a huge increase in the carbon footprint per person. Especially residential heating means a lot here, and that's because the culture changes. Suddenly you don't want to sit with a big woolen sweater like I do. You want to sit in your underwear and still feel warm. But then we see a kind of a drop again in the more present times. And that's not because we stopped having warm homes. Actually, they got warmer, they got bigger, the homes too. We were driving more in our cars, but there was a focus on improving technology, and that made a big difference. So actually, carbon footprint today is per person on the same level as it was 100 years ago. As I said, there's a lot of modeling behind these results, a lot of data. I won't present much of it, but I'll just give you an example of the electricity production, which means a lot. So as you can see on the top graph, the coal engines, they got much better at actually using the energy of the fuel you put in them. At the same time, the electricity that was produced when that was new in Denmark, only half of it would reach the consumer. It would simply disappear in the power lines as loss. Today, that has been reduced to only a few percent disappearing. And on the left side, you see how the energy mix for heating our homes changed through time, from being based on a lot on coal and coke and wood. And in the future, we see a transition towards a lot of district heat and geothermal heat. And that is based on national Danish scenarios that are modeled in premise, and they will soon be available to download and use as a scenario. In my work, I want to bridge the future, what we can learn from that, bridge that to the past. Here you see some of the houses that was used in on the housing segment of our historical results. And basically, we went from small homes with many people to very few people living in big homes. This is reflected by the blue line here, where we see the amount of square meters per person in Denmark rise a lot over time, reaching the highest in Europe, actually. But at the same time, the yellow graph, it shows that less energy was used to heat each of these square meters. Although that seems to be stagnating in the future, there's simply a limit to how much we can isolate our houses. To the top right, you have the graph with the black, red, and green, and that shows the development of climate intensity of district heating. And in the green one, that's the more positive scenarios used with the premise that Romain just showed. It seems to be stagnating. And in the worst case, it actually increases a little again after 2035. Actually, so this shows that technology alone does not seem to be able to save us all the time. We need to do something with our consumption of square meters. And that's why I've been looking a bit into the tiny house movement as a way to change our consumption. So now we're assuming that it will be possible to live on only about half of the square meters per person, because you're shifting some of your space to be a garden or living in a completely different way. But there's a trade-off, as you see under the big greenhouse here, that suddenly you need different heating technologies to heat your house. At least that's how it looks today. That's not district heating, I can tell you. So let's focus a little more on that, and I'll talk a little more about the preliminary results of this. But what you see here on the right side is the results of living in a tiny house in year 2050 compared to a house and an apartment. And this green bar, the result, that assumes that the tiny house will in the future be supported to be heated by district heating and geothermal heat. And in that case, it will be the most per person. So assuming you have less space, it will be a very sustainable or climate-friendly way to live compared to a house and an apartment. But I've also made an error bar on top of it. And that error bar reflects, well, in the case that it is not politically supported to live in a tiny house and to bring district heating and other green technologies there, then the result would be, the climate impact would be higher and on the same level as an apartment. Essentially, that gives us choices of how to live sustainable in a big apartment in the city or a small tiny house out on the countryside. And I think this is a good time to round off by saying, what can we learn from the past? And here on the left, you see what were the results given the context of 1970. In that case, you could see, in general, the climate impact was much higher. We were using a lot of heat, burning oil. But at that time, tiny houses did not make sense. The heat would simply just heat up your garden, go out of the walls. And what I, in this paper, plan to do is to pressure a bit and say, okay, current legislations, are they actually focused on this paradigm of the 1970s? And should they be restructured a bit to actually reflect a future green transition, where we also support changing our consumption a bit more? And with that, I'll say thank you and open up for some questions if there should be any.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Do we have questions from the audience?
Hi, I have a question. Thank you very much, Simon. So do I understand correctly that the tiny house is more an alternative concept for the single housing, not directly apartments in big cities? Because I don't think it's a solution for everyone. especially when you think about population density and things like this.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I agree with what you said, because it's a good solution for different kind of people. Some would like to live in an apartment in a city, and some don't. And the results here suggest that in any case, if you want to like have your own house, then living in a normal single family house has a bigger impact on the climate. And here the tiny house could be an alternative. If you want to live in a house, have your own garden, then if you can accept having a smaller house, then that will have the same or better climate impact compared to an apartment.
Thank you.
And I hope that brings some diversity, that there's different ways to live sustainably.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not everyone can live in a tiny house even they want to, so we don't have enough space for that, I guess. But if you're rich enough, maybe. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And maybe first 𝐓𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬 and then Arthur.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first, congratulations for the interesting work. I was curious if you took into account any stock dynamics in your analysis, because houses are things that we already have, so there's a huge stock available. And have you considered combining it with what will be the population growth over the coming years? Because not every new person added to the Danish society will need a new house necessarily.
Thank you for your question. I think it's very relevant. And in this study, what we've done is we considered the average stock, because the houses and apartments that people live in now, most of them are actually built in the 1970s and then gradually renovated over time. So we consider that. Most studies only consider new houses. And I think it's a very good suggestion that combining it with the future population and maybe how much of the stock should be converted into, for example, tiny houses in order to stay within national goals of climate impact. And that is coming in the discussion of the paper too. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amelie. And also thanks for the question before, but that went in a very similar direction. So I think my question is obsolete. Thanks. And thanks, Simon, for the very interesting presentation, the cool work.
Thank you.
𝐒𝐫𝐿.
Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I joined a bit late. So I was just wondering if you have considered any rebound effects, because with the tiny houses, my assumption is that they'll probably be cheaper than the regular houses or the apartments. So do you think, is it considered here, the rebound effects of the rich guys getting multiple tiny houses in different prime estates?
I think you talk into a thing that's really important to consider. I'm not considering in this paper to limit the scope and get my messages clear across. But I think it's very interesting for the discussion. Like also, if you live on the countryside, you have to remember you have to drive to the city. So maybe you might be shifting just to the transport sector. And as you say, rebound effects regarding money, I think it's a very valid consideration.
Yeah.
And I hope people will see my study and say, oh, that's interesting. Let's add this layer and make a study on rebound effects.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hey, there's been another question in the chat. If you can share the link to your paper. I think what you're showing right now is ongoing work.
It's
maybe
fresh results, and I hope they will soon be published.
Okay.
So find me on LinkedIn or Google Scholar or wherever you stay tuned with people's publications, and then I hope it will soon be out.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again, Simon.
Thank you.
And now we can move on to the last presentation for today, which is from Amelie.
Yes, you can see my, no, you can't yet. 1 second. Now you can see my screen.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, after such a great perspectives on the past and the future, we'll have the final presentation on something in between, on a method to do time-explicit LCA. So to cover multiple time steps in one coherent methodology, combining elements of dynamic and prospective LCA in one framework. This is a fantastic project together with the researchers listed here. Throughout this presentation, I'll use the case study of an electric vehicle to demonstrate the concepts, and then later to demonstrate the software and the results on the implications of the method. So for a normal LCA, if you would look at an electric vehicle, you would consider that everything happens statically today using data that is hopefully at least representative of today's system. And you would get a score across different impact categories, such as, for example, global warming potential. Then, as we've heard from Romain, there's also prospective LCA gaining more and more attention, where you model the system at a specific future point in time, for example, the year 2040, and you take technological evolution, both in the foreground, but maybe also in the wider economy into consideration. And you might have a different score, which might improve because you have a scenario that looks at more green supply chains. What you don't consider in prospective LCA is that the system doesn't actually happen today, but it also doesn't happen only in 2040, but actually the processes in the life cycle to produce, use, and dispose of the electric vehicle occur over time. And dynamic LCA is a branch of LCA that considers that to some extent. In dynamic LCA, you distribute the emissions to when they actually occur in time. And then you apply dynamic impact assessment using time-based characterization factors to then evaluate the time-based impact of your emissions. Because of the short presentation, that is a little bit out of scope, but in our method we propose, this is also an optional way to, in the end, characterize your inventory. However, dynamic LCA on the other side forgets that by the time we have end of life in 2040, although it recognizes that the emission occurs in 2040, we might have a different technology for the end of life process. So what happens if you put that both together? So if you consider the timing of processes and emission and the state of their technology landscape, then we get time-explicit LCA, where we really check out when a process occurs and what data do we have available for that process at that timestamp. You might think, why do we need a new method for that? We can just implement that in our foreground system. We know it consumes electricity in the years between 2025 and 2035, so we manually link that. And this is a pragmatic approach, and you can do that. But if you think of the deeper supply chain levels of your system, this doesn't work manually anymore, because at every step in your supply chain, you have a delay in the production system as the materials needed for production of the factory and all of that is sort of delayed in time. And this adds up quite quickly a very high level of complexity. And that is where an algorithm is quite useful. And this is what you can find in the Python package we wrote called Brightway_Time-explicit, which is part of the Brightway ecosystem. So you can combine it with any other Brightway-based LCA. And as I said, you can let it track the timing of the processes and the emissions and include how those processes and their supply chain evolve over time in one framework. And you can also have, optionally, if you want, dynamic impact assessments for climate change metrics. Our guiding principles was to develop a very simple method. So the additional user input is very limited and a very flexible method. So we don't tell you what kind of temporal resolution you will need to provide or the amount of additional data. All of that is up to you, up to your data availability, but also up to your research needs, because different projects might look at different temporal relations. Also, we provide ample documentation and examples to make this as beginner-friendly as possible. Okay, what does it do in a nutshell? You have to give it very little. You have to give it a set of processes which have temporal information. The temporal information is like an attribute, such as uncertainty or location on the level of the exchanges, telling you how much of that exchange is consumed when. And you also have to give it a set of background databases that represents the technology landscape at a certain point of time. For example, using premise to create these time-specific scenario databases. And then you can sit back and let Time-explicit do the rest. And the first thing it'll do is to propagate the temporal information throughout the system using graph traversal and convolution, and sort of adding up the temporal information to get a absolute temporal sequence of when what is happening in a timeline. And this timeline of processes is then used to modify the original static LCA matrices to incorporate when what is happening and what technology landscape is then used. That's the most challenging part, and we'll quickly look into how that actually works. But once you have the modified matrices, you can do conventional impact assessments or dynamic ones to get your scores. Okay, at the core piece, we modify the original matrices. Here you can see an example of the original matrices. Your intertechnology matrix or technology matrix would contain processes that belong to your foreground and to your background system. You'd also have a matrix of the environmental flows, the B matrix, and then a demand vector. What we do is that we expand the original matrix. And the foreground system, so those processes with temporal information, we expand so that every process occurring at a time step becomes its own separate process. This means that if you consume electricity at 2 points in time, you would now have 2 electricity processes for each point in time 1. And then we add the other relevant background databases and the processes that are then needed to the system. And we add something we have coined temporal markets. That is sort of a translation between the temporalized processes and then the time-specific background databases. And the temporal markets can be understood as similar to a regional market, as a market that spreads the demand for a product not across regions, but across time. So for example, the temporal market for electricity in 2027 might spread it between databases that you have for 2020 and 2030. And then we have to relink the different elements of the matrix. And then we have retained the temporal information with the time-specific flows at the level of the technosphere matrix. And we do the same at the level of the biosphere matrix. There might be additional temporal information. So if you have a delay in emission, that is also translated into the timing of the biosphere flow. All right. Then let's demonstrate that with a case study of the electric vehicle using just the equivalent processes, but adding temporal information to that. You can see that we have a lifetime of 15 years and that different parts of the production chain occur earlier and that the recycling occurs later. And the electricity consumption during the use phase is uniformly distributed. For the time-explicit databases, we use premise, a 1.5 degree scenario, and created databases for 3 time steps. And we activate the process in 2024. That's the starting year when the lifetime of the vehicle starts. I'm jumping right into the results, which you can see here in the middle, splits by time step. So the cumulative climate change score would be something around 12,000 a kilogram. And you can see when it actually occurs and by which process. And I would like to draw your attention to the use phase. I said electricity is consumed uniformly, so at each time step, the same amounts. but the impacts are not uniformly, but decrease with time, as in the later years, the more clean 1.5 degree scenario databases are used, which have a lower impact per kilowatt hour of electricity. Now let's compare that to the ways we do LCAs at the moment. So either a normal, which we call static LCA here on the left, or a fully prospective LCA modeling the entire system in the year 2040. And you can see that the difference in score is quite substantial. So we would have almost half the results from the static, but also almost double the one from the prospective. So we are somewhere in between. And that's also the message we want to try to get across, that it's a more realistic understanding if you have that time-explicit modeling of the supply chain. Now, that's the end of the presentation, and I hope that you could take away that this new package allows you to do both dynamic and prospective LCA at once. So you can consider the timing of your processes, but also the evolving supply chains over time. We are currently writing the paper on that, so please stay tuned on that. And we're still also working to improve the performance of the package, hopefully enabling that also temporalization can be done throughout the entire system. Yeah, thank you. And I'm happy to take any question.
Okay, thanks, Amelie. There have already been 2 questions in the chat by the 2 previous presenters. Simon, do you want to repeat your question?
I can't see it at the moment, but
I can restate. Thanks for the presentation. Really interesting work. Actually, I just saw it somehow on LinkedIn, I think 2 days before you wrote and invited me to this presentation. So very curious on that. My question is, for this car driving for 15 years, do I have to produce 15 prospective databases, or can I just make 2 and the algorithm will interpolate between them?
Indeed, the latter. You can do 2, you can do 3, you can do as many as you want, and the algorithm will interpolate between whatever you provide. Because the database has a timestamp, and the process has a timestamp. And then we interpolate between those timestamps, always finding the most fitting one amongst the things you provide.
And a follow-up, is it the characterized results that are being interpolated, or is it the inventories that are being interpolated?
The inventories.
Okay, wow. Good job.
Okay. The second question that's in the chat was from Romain, but turned his camera off, so I'll just read it. The question was if the prospective case and results that you showed, shouldn't they have been calculated for the year 2024 instead of 2040? Because 2040 is only the end of life year in this case.
Yes, in our case, one could say that. But if you look at literature and at prospective LCA studies, they often model the entire system at one future point in year, maybe at multiple, that they sort of say, okay, what happens in 2030, 2040, 2050? But then everything happens there and not just the end of life year. That's what we want to do better in the time-explicit approach, that we spread it across the years, if year is your favorite time unit, but it can also be flexible, for example, across days or seasons. Maybe for an agricultural case study, that would make more sense. Yeah. So
I think my question was rather, here you compare it from a static LCA using 𝐒𝐿CO and the prospective case where a life cycle is modeled in 2040. But your time-explicit case is modeling starting 2024. So if you want to compare it to a prospective only case, you should take 2024 as well, or no?
Maybe then we should say that the static case should be 2024.
Yeah. Okay. Never mind. It was just for my own understanding.
I get your point. Yeah.
Thanks.
Maybe just as an addition to that, I think that's like a very critical point, because like that's like maybe the benefit of the method, because you cannot really pinpoint what year you want to allocate all the impacts to, because in reality it's just spread over time, because you use the car and consume the electricity not at one point in time, but at several points in time. So yeah, maybe that's exactly one of the questions this tries to kind of get around, even though of course you still have to make some choices. Yeah. Okay. And there was also a similar comment in the chat, or something in between the years 2024 and 2040. Yeah. Yeah. 𝐒𝐫𝐚𝐘?
Yes, very nice presentation as well. I was just wondering how did you handle the sensitivity of the uncertainty factor to the time parameter?
Yeah, what we contributes to the scientific debate is a method. So we are sort of a little bit leaving the interpretation, but also the quality of the data to the users. So the user needs to make sure that the temporal information they provide makes sense, and maybe they can sort of have a couple of different scenarios to test different temporal configurations. But in the method itself, we don't really consider that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe to also follow up on that, this is in general a question. If you start making prospective databases, I mean, in the eco event you have some uncertainty information, but the question is, as soon as you start changing this, like what is this uncertainty information is based on the current activity data, which might be old already. There's some pedigree matrix approach to account for temporal correlation, like if it's very old data, or geographic correlation. But what do these mean as you start projecting into future scenarios, right? So as Amelie already said, like it's best to compare different scenario cases, and this is never a prediction, but the uncertainty from the actual eco event, which can actually be, using this methodology, you could still include this, because the matrix-based approach is still existing, so you might still theoretically use that. I'm not sure if it will work currently, but it also loses its meaning. Does that maybe also answer the question a bit?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and I think this kind of automatically turned into a more general discussion now. So maybe just to officially transition to that, I just want to basically continue on the topic we were talking about, and just want to raise the question to everyone in the room. How much sense, or what the trade-off is between having these fancy methods to calculate stuff, be it for prospective, historical, or time-explicit LCA, when at the same time the underlying data is just not so accurate. So what happens to the uncertainties? How sure can we be about the results? And what should people consider when they use these methods and interpret the results? Any opinions on this?
I think that maybe one interesting point was already the comparison that Amelie did. So we kind of saw the magnitude that the results can differ depending on using the dynamic approach of emission release or not. So I think like doubling the total impacts is quite a big influence on the results. And then it depends, I mean, of course, what are the effects of different parameters being uncertain? And that then depends again on the characteristic of the uncertainty of the parameters.
I think I would add to that it also depends on how your system looks like. So if you consider the production of lime by calcination, then 95% of your impact is at the kiln level, and it receives very little influence from the outside world, and therefore from your scenario. So as long as you have your foreground correct, you're safe. The problem with future studies is that we often consider emerging technologies which tend to outsource direct emissions upstream in the supply chain. And this is where you open the system to becoming more vulnerable with respect to the assumptions that are made in the background. So typically, a gasoline car has a much higher index of reliability than the LCA of a battery electric car, because 60–70% of the impact is the combustion of gasoline, for which you usually have pretty good data about.
Yeah, thanks. Nicholas, you were raising your hand.
Thank you. Really interesting, really nice. I was thinking now about, did you test with which resolution you can actually go? What's the highest resolution you can take in? Thinking about maybe live energy markets prognosis for next week or upcoming month. Can you go in minute steps or even second steps?
Yeah, the algorithm below is in seconds, so you can give it whatever you want. We are working on the computational time that also larger systems run within reasonable time. But I think you also need to consider, if you have a very detailed temporal resolution, is LCA then still the correct tool to use that? Maybe like hourly electricity mix is still a valid use case, but LCA, I think, is not necessarily made for that very specific real-time type of assessment.
Fair. That's very fair, yes.
To your point, Timo, that you raised earlier on what to do if the data is not as good. I also discovered in my thesis that I was writing on energy storage technologies that, for example, right, some of the foreground or some of the activities in 𝐒𝐿CO are very outdated, like the solar energy or the wind energy, which probably are a factor 4 off currently in the carbon impacts. I think there we probably need to somehow focus on the ones that are really important. For example, clean energy needs to be a very updated number because we're using that for everything to look into the future, and that's a big driving factor. And I'm right as a mechanical engineer always are very surprised on how detached the whole engineering process manufacturing science is from the LCA science, and I feel like there we need to much better work together to include all the knowledge that is available in the engineering faculties to the environmental science faculties.
And maybe as an addition, not only from the faculties, but also from the actual manufacturers and the industry.
Absolutely, right. I mean, this is, I've also worked professionally a lot with batteries. You see that different mines can have a factor 10 or 20 different in environmental impacts, just because it's a completely different earth or concentration of material, a different production process, different energy uses. The real data is so off to some of those databases. I don't know, like I've seen how industry can collaborate together and provide real data, but then that's always the issue with intellectual property. But then you kind of have to set up like a clean team that collects the data from the real people, cleans it up, anonymizes it, and then like consolidatedly publishes it with right uncertainty factors and so on. Then they're usually fine with it. But yeah, that needs a lot of work and more like industry associations driving this. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And with that, we've already reached the end of this session. So thanks again to you all for your attendance. Yeah, if you're curious, all the presentation slides will be uploaded to Zenodo, and all the recordings will be uploaded to YouTube by the ISIE on the ISIE channel. So yeah, feel free to check that out if you want to go back to these presentations, or if you have missed a presentation today. And yeah, so thanks again. Have a great, nice afternoon, you all, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the sessions of the IE Day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.